So getting projects off on the right foot's pretty important. That pulls heavily on the process design level of PPM. Today, we're pleased to have John Strickland join us to share his experience in helping projects get off on the right foot and generate smooth flow. John is a principal at Collaborative Flow, and he's been a pioneer in bringing innovative thinking to engineering, procurement, and construction with a passion for workplace safety, learning, innovation, and smooth flow. Many years of job site and corporate construction operations leadership, combined with extensive study and research of project delivery systems, led to a series of breakthrough projects. He's introduced lean thinking to countless teams, led 3 major clients as they transformed their project delivery organizations around lean IPD. He's currently the co-chair on a joint working group supported by the Lean Construction Institute, the Construction Industry Institute, and the Project Production Institute. So John, welcome, and we look forward to hearing what you got to share with us.
Well, great. Thank you. It's great to be here. You're seeing my screen now, and so
See you just fine.
I see a lot of familiar faces. I've enjoyed hearing the presentation. So this is about some of the big ways that affect our projects. And I want to start out kind of by acknowledging that what we do is really pretty amazing in our industry. And we've built some great things, incredible accomplishments. But I think everyone here is of the idea that we have to do better. And towards that end, I'm hit by some big questions, very similar to what Glenn was talking about just a minute ago about target value delivery. Because for every project, the owner especially needs to know, hey, can we build what we want for the money we've got? When will it be done? And when can you give me an answer to those questions? And I think we can do a lot better job of answering those questions if we talk a little bit more about really understanding what we really need to do to answer those questions, which actions are needed first, addressing how well we really understand scope, risk, and uncertainties, and then looking at there's probably ways where we find frustration. And I think we're going to find lots of places to find the frustration. So for the topics for today, I'll be talking about the process, and it's very, very similar. In fact, it's essentially the target value delivery process that Glenn was just describing. And then a little bit of that, something a little bit different, is a transition from the work breakdown structures most of us use to a work integration structure that aligns the cost to value and builds integration in from day one instead of trying to patch it back together later on. And I'll talk briefly about the initiative to link lean, advanced work packaging, and operations science. And this kind of reminds me of a conversation I had with one of our senior design managers at the firm I worked with. And we're meeting at the coffee room. He said, John, I'm just overwhelmed. I can't get enough staff. I can't train the people I've got. Everyone's yelling at me. We can't hire enough people. And among the things I talked about was, well, that sounds quite frustrating, but just curious, how often do your team members go produce a lot more content than was required to answer the next question, and then have to do it all over again when something changes? Well, he said that happens every day. And that's what I thought, but I wonder why we keep doing that. And he says, we have no choice. It's in the system. And that led me to, why don't we change the system? And the whole purpose of this time I'm going to spend with you today is kind of talking about, hoping to stimulate the same little bit of interest as, hey, what can we do different? And if you look at how a typical project delivery flows at a very high level, this is not any particular company or necessarily industry, but most projects start out, you hire an engineer, an architect, CM, you do some preliminary design, you get some kind of preliminary estimate, and you say, hey, does that fit the budget? And if the answer is no, you might go back and change that and rework it. But very often, you go right on in to detailed design. You've got the design team hired. You've got a deadline to hit. And you go on through and you get contractor bids. And kind of the insidious thing is usually the people who did the preliminary estimate aren't terribly involved in the detailed design. The design team doesn't fully understand the estimates. And so after you've used almost all your design budget and a lot of your duration, and after you've exercised your contractors to go bid this project, you find out, hey, is it going to fit our budget now? And if that's yes, well, you get a semi-reliable cost. I think we've heard a lot about the rates of change order, and that's really when the change order process begins. The problem, of course, is what if it doesn't hit the budget? Then you've got this enormous negative iteration as you go, where value engineering got its bad name, where you go tear the design apart. These people were supposed to be off working on something else. They're coming back. These people are being exercised again, and it's a pretty miserable experience. It's kind of a train wreck. And so there's surely a way for us to go do something better. And so a few of the wastes I'm talking about, and we can classify whether these are muda or whatever it might be, but there's obviously some time lost. So to redesign, to rebid the process when the cost comes in. And then there's also the highly detailed design deliverables that people produce that end up often getting reworked or discarded. And then the poor utilization of design and construction capacity. And one thing I didn't mention on the last slide is I presented that a lot of times, and I asked folks, how often does this happen? Is it just me imagining this is what's happening in the world? And I've gotten the answer back dozens and dozens of times. Nope, that's pretty much most of our projects. Again, why are we doing that? So we see these wastes. A little bit of the waste that we don't necessarily see are the opportunity cost of constructability and the how not built into the design, and the viable cost savings that are never considered. So a lot of times, if you were engaging the contractors, they would come up with ideas to do it better if you talked to them before the whole thing was designed. A little less obvious are viable scope or entire projects that get scrapped because they couldn't come to the right price. And the reason I'm saying that is after going through some alternate process, we've been able to keep the project on track. And then the other thing we also find about this process is sometimes we find out that there isn't a solution that meets the owner's budget. And it's great to find that out before you spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars on design effort and waste all that capacity. So we also have a risk here of a waste of the risk and uncertainties that stay in the system for a long time. And when they surface during construction, they are extremely expensive to deal with. And had we had the right people involved early on, we could have avoided them. And of course, as you go through that cycle, I just talked about the teamwork and the culture is damaged, the credibility is shot. And I welcome folks to put in the chat, are there more wastes that I'm not thinking of? But these seem like quite a bit. And so if you want to think about what you could do about that, instead of doing this, maybe we could do something like this. And this is the essence of target value delivery, or very consistent with it. You start by selecting the design team and an integrator. And an integrator is very different than a construction manager, at least in my world. Construction managers manage contracts, integrators manage flow. We use contracts, but we manage flow. If you can, bring your trade partners in early. I say that you get better results with trade partners. I'm going to show a couple of examples of where we got some good value, even when we couldn't. The TBD process that I've used and other people I work with have used is collaborative design and scoping that actually started in the late 90s with the Neenan Company and IDC. And one of the big things we learned, we don't need the design to know what it's going to cost. We need a very good scope list, which we can produce quickly. Then we'll still go through the cycle perhaps, but we'll go through it quickly so we can negotiate and adjust and have a more reliable cost. And my experience is the cost we get here way early in a project is more reliable than the cost you get out of here. And that for all kinds of reasons, but if none other, that the people who estimate it are committed to hitting it. Out here, the contractors have no responsibility or ownership of the scope. And then you go do the design. And what often lets us go forward, convinces owners to try this, is we can always get going faster. It's always a faster approach. So what I'll talk about now, so that was the whole notion of what Glenn talked about, is this process. He talked about it quite well. I won't talk about it a lot more. I'll talk a little bit in that flow chart. So we go through this design, the scoping process. We use the big rooms. We used choosing by advantage. We use the multiple work teams. In fact, this is a work group team here. We use the modeling, a lot of things like you heard Alex talk about earlier. I'm going to talk a little bit about this concept of pricing based on a scope list, which allows us to go do the validation. And the big, this looks like this, and this is putting the scope along with select drawings, sketches, as we call it sketchy design, but in a data sheet format. that will look that's easier for people to deal with and process and sort and filter and do all kinds of things. And it's built around a concept around fundamental scope blocks. And fundamental scope blocks are chunks of work, maybe modular, that add a specific capability or value at some manageable level of detail. And they're usually the natural focus of coordination. So if you have an air handling unit that provides conditioned air to the space, I can't bring the equipment in until I have the conditioned space. Well, I have to have all these things for the air handling unit to work, to use it. And so we can then use these, and we can distribute these FSBs to the various work groups. They can own it. They own the scope. They own the cost. We can put it all back together. They also lead you to visualize, keyword here, the execution strategy. So you're thinking about whether this is going to be a modular unit, how it's going to be fabricated, who's going to do what, when we're going to go do it. This is all being visualized by the people who are going to create it. It's also a great place to add costs. And also this does, by the way, apply to both physical and administrative scopes. We'll have fundamental scope blocks for all their general conditions and general requirements items. And special thanks to my friend Jeff Loeb for helping me define that. But you see this this air handling unit, the real key to this is actually the scope activities. So scope activities are actions. So the FSB is a noun, it's something you're going to go do. The fundamental scope, the scope activities are how you're going to go do it. So for my air handling unit, there's going to be a scope activity for some particular person to provide and deliver the air handler. There's going to be a scope activity for someone to set and anchor it. There's going to be a scope activity for a particular contractor to install a housekeeping pad. It'll be designed by the structural engineer. So these scope activities are specific construction actions that are going to be done by a particular crew as a continuous operation. And it's real similar to a forecast of what your pole planning might be later on, because they define the key interfaces and handoffs between trades. The thing is they're also specific to a trade, discipline, and system. So you would never have a scope activity that involved multiple contractors or multiple designs. And when you do that, you can then roll things together. These also, by the way, map to BIM, and they form a common denominator. So to set that, the air handling unit, you'd have a concrete pad. There's going to be a scope activity to install a return air duct and supply air duct. That'll be done by a mechanical engineer and installed by an HVAC contractor. You'll probably have someone put the smoke detector in the return air duct and connect it to fire alarm. You'll probably have someone connecting up the facility control system. You'll have a different discipline, the electrical engineer, electrical contractor will provide the feed. Someone's going to provide the chilled water header, and someone's going to do the condensate drain. And so these are all identified as scope activities. And the key thing is the conversation that they all have together to define what this is. So it's real clear as you're talking about the chilled water header. Hey, is this going to be insulated? Who's doing the installation? When should we go do it? So those are the two big building blocks. And I was reminded of them as I saw Alex's and Hannah's presentation earlier. Real similar. This concept of intrinsically integrated information is very powerful, because if you have the scope activities identified to a performer, design, discipline, and trade system, well, that started out as the basis of estimate. This is where this was born in the 90s. But as this come on, we recognize, wow, that's also the basis of design. You map it to BIM, your equipment list, your issues and reporting. So all these go into one place, so they're intrinsically integrated. So that instead of having all these separate management systems that you're trying to coordinate, you draw them all off of the same denominator for a multi-dimensional work breakdown structure that is useful on demand, who needs it, and can be kept up to date in real time. This really changes the nature of your project control systems, and it really helps enable these functional work group teams that are most effective for doing projects. So take many platforms that start out as Excel. In fact, this was a form developed in the 90s. It's actually still being used by a major, one of the largest consumer products companies in the world. They're doing their projects doing CDS processes and developing scope lists using this template. Much more powerful is something you could go do in QuickBase or some other relational database where you put all this stuff together and tie it together. But what's kind of odd is one of the success factors I have said if you can have the trade contractors involved is we actually had a team. We presented this at Lean Design Forum, or I believe at the LCI Congress last year, where they couldn't get the full process, but they got the design team and the owner together to create a functional scope block. They created a whole series of them for their project. This is the one for the air handler, and you notice this is from a real project. So they did this in Bluebeam, but they did the design requirements for each one, the information needs. They came up with the scope activities, and they found this extremely useful. And so the concept of really understanding your scope has been very powerful for lots of people. Another example of when we didn't do the full thing, we had an internal program when I was with Burns & McDonnell to go reconfigure a production system, a big prefabrication shop and yard. They'd done a design once before with lots of formal design. They came up with a very unusable and unsatisfactory experience. So we looked at the next version with the mini CDS with a fraction of the time we normally spent. But what we came out was everyone understood the scope list allowed us to understand scope much better. And this certainly prevented lots of rework that would have otherwise have happened. And the cost was organized and useful, much more useful to the owner. And so we rolled up the cost by FSB. So if the owner wanted to know what his new bridge crane system cost, well, here's what this costs and here's why, which is different than a lot of construction estimates. And if you go look at the last time, you think about the last time you bought a car, you probably cared quite a bit about what features it had and what they cost. You probably cared what kind of interior it had. You probably cared what kind of a sound system it had. You probably didn't care at all how many inches of wire or how many pounds of steel were in your car. And so getting this in that format makes it much more readily, much easier for the owner to apply target value delivery. Here's what the parts are, here's what each one of them costs, and here's why. But kind of reason I put this in here is one of our most cynical people got to the end of this, did the estimate, and said, wow, I'm very confident that the estimate we put together with the miniature approach was within 15% of accuracy, but you got to realize we did this with 2% engineering. Well, I think that's a little bit of hyperbole. There was more than 2% engineering thought, certainly at this point, but probably about 2% or 5% of the engineering deliverable content. We didn't have rolls and rolls of drawings. We had a scope database. That's what we were able to go work with. So just a little bit more about, I fully support the idea of engaging trade partners. I recommend it every single time. I get asked a lot, hey, but what if we just can't? And rather than just give up, I think of it this way, that projects to me are kind of like driving across a treacherous icy mountain road a bunch of times. And what we've been doing is using a two-wheel drive vehicle with all-season tires. And hey, we get there sometimes. Sometimes we don't. It would be a lot better to have a all-wheel drive SUV with winter tires. That would be, everyone can go see how that is. This is, to me, traditional delivery. This is kind of the target value IPD approach. But even if I can't change my fundamental vehicle, I can change the tires. So I can put winter tires at least on my other car. And so the message here is this concept of concise scope definition, the map to what the functions you're going to use is useful, whatever form of delivery you have. So make a few key points. Here, one is that this is the process and the scoping app are team sports. The owner is part of the team. The owner does not sit above the team and watch it work. We desperately need the owner in there. And it's the interaction of the discussion of how we're going to do it is where the real value is made. So you wouldn't send someone off in isolation to go prepare any of what I'm talking about. And one of the reasons I think it's superior is it will be different. So we talk about, hey, I did the project the traditional way and it came up with this scope and cost, and I did the project through the integrated way, came up with this scope and cost. Well, the scope and cost is going to be different because the approach that a team will come up with using this approach is going to be different than what the design team would have ever otherwise developed. We've seen that over and over again. It's going to be easier to build. It's going to be more complete, be better understood. So if you have it much better understood and more complete, your risk is going to be a lot lower. You're going to learn and understand much faster. In fact, this is a great way to develop staff, just to have them sit as part of this. They understand the decisions we're making and why. Maybe a topic for another day, but competition and collaboration are not mutually exclusive. You can make this process very competitive and get the best people on your project. I'll make a comment that using a relational database allows us to scale. I mean, the air handler example I made was very simple, but you can do a multi-billion-dollar plant putting these together. And then what we kind of hear from owners seem to like a owner-focused approach, and particularly the one that's focused on their conditions of satisfaction that reduces their gaps in understanding. And then the contractors are much more confident in their estimates. When we get through the CDS process, it's time to go price it out. We'll invariably ask the contractors, hey, are you confident in it? And they'll say, yeah, I'm much more confident than I would have been because I've helped define the scope. And in the scoping app, the more powerful database version, we actually assign estimating confidence for each FSB. So as they run together, we understand how much we know about it. So kind of wrapping up a whirlwind tour, we'll jump into this notion of linking advanced work packaging with lean thinking and PPI. And several people, I'm sure, brought this up and think I've completely lost my senses. But I don't think so. I've talked to folks throughout here, and what we're recognizing is we're largely trying to accomplish the same thing. And this won't be easy. But if we develop a generation of leaders who have better understanding, we're going to get better projects. And that's what we're trying to go do. A key reason I thought this might work in the first place was, if we thought about the ADB construction work packages are very trade specific, they're very siloed, they're very top down. That's one of the problems with them. Well, if we configure those as FSBs, then they'd be multidisciplined, they'd be coordinated intrinsically, and that would be a big step forward. And then actually the installation work packages they talk about in ADB are very much like the scope activities I talked about. The differences be when you identify it and when you added the detail. And then, of course, we could integrate production system design with the facility design. So we're talking about how we're going to go build it. And by the way, we might use some operations science to alleviate this massive inability of that train wreck system we have early on the pre-construction phase of the projects, and then shape how we do this in general. So that's a quick overview. We go back, the four purposes of lean to make things easier, better, faster, cheaper. Most people are quite familiar with that. And I'm not saying projects are easy, but they'll definitely be easier and a lot less frustrating. And better, cheaper, and faster are likely as well. So with that, pretty close to the timing. What do we have for comments?
Good on time. Thank you. So we'll see if we get any questions floating in. I'll get one to get the ball rolling. Kind of new to the general building sector. How did that sector get so married to the design build process?
Yeah, you have to go back a long time. I think a lot of folks like the idea of watching people compete for things, and that it's also it's just how life is. And I think there's an expectation that it's supposed to be hard. In fact, I sometimes think that one of the big objections we get is, quit trying to be so smart. Just put up with it and go deal with it. You'll run your head through the brick wall, and it hurts. It's causing a lot more disruption than we need. Yeah. It's also, when projects were simpler, it seemed to work. But as projects have gotten dramatically more complex, it's just almost impossible to fully convey what the owner's trying to do with what the construction scope is that satisfies it. Because nearly every time you ask an owner, which option do you want, they're going to ask, well, how much do they cost? Okay. And so it's great to have the people who can answer those questions and understand what the owner wants with you.
Okay, we got a question here. Do we expect that the costs of integrating / interfacing between FSBs will always be small compared to the FSBs themselves? Or do we have to do something to make that happen?
The interface, well, there's certainly, I don't think there's any extra cost. One of the huge advantages of the scope activities is they connect the FSBs together. So when a change comes up, it's it's much easier to go see the total impact of the change on all the things that it connects. And so I wish I had time to show you how this works in relational database, but we go look at something, we can roll up all the scope activities by the trade that's going to go do them. We can roll them up by system. We can roll them up by area. So everyone has a very good comprehensive understanding of how this all fits together. And that's actually, you're breaking it apart, but the real value is the conversation of integrating it back together before you ever start the design.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, it looks like we're wearing them down there, John.
Yeah. Yes. Getting towards the end.
Okay. Well, we might as well move on to our next topic. Thank you so much for
Oh, you bet.
the paper
My
and
pleasure.
the presentation. We really appreciate your time and effort.
You bet.